Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Matt Segall. Matt is an assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He's also behind the YouTube channel and blog Footnotes to Plato, which has got some really rich stuff there, focusing on issues related to process philosophy and the study of consciousness. You do courses. I've watched you in conversation with John Vervaeke and a bunch of other folks. Just really, you have a deep knowledge of Whiteheadian philosophy, and process philosophy, and the whole study of consciousness is sort of a specialty. So I'd love to dig into some of that with you today. But yeah, well, in a minute we'll just dive right in. But thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, Brendan. It's always fun to be in dialogue with other folks who are surfing this terrain. Yeah, consciousness is definitely at the center of my own interests, but kind of touches on everything else, So philosophy of nature,
Hmm.
religious studies, all that stuff is of interest, deep and abiding interest for me. So.
Well, one of the kind of the schema I was thinking we could kind of do for this conversation, which I think would be really fun, would be to go all the way back to the beginning. I want to get your thoughts about trying to paint this picture. All right. I'm really interested in meta narrative tellings of big history, and particularly within this sort of metamodern context of a return to big storytelling and meta narratological thinking. I've seen so much really fascinating consilience and confluent synergies of different thinkers and different paradigms sort of converging on something that seems to me very uh, uh, intelligible. There's a lot of similarity in sort of the tale that's emerged, I would say, in the past. I don't know. We could even talk about what the time frame has been. Um, and so I wanted to kind of go through that a little bit and get your take on it. This will become clearer, I think, in a couple minutes. So bear with me. But I guess to contextualize that a little bit, here's what I'm here. Here's what I'm thinking that is essentially. So, whether it's sort of the integral, framing of things in the work of Ken Wilber, you're at the California Institute of Integral Studies, or there's also the other big history models, Greg Enriquez I've been talking to recently, in his unified theory of knowledge model, um, and there seems to be, those are just some examples, this sort of confluence of thinking of this 13.7 billion year story of evolution that's unfolded, um, a complexification narrative wherein, over these epochs of time, there's been the advance of creative novelty, I guess, to use sort of a Whiteheadian turn of phrase, that has produced sort of a successive stack of complexification layers. Um, some people tie the evolution of consciousness into this narrative in a really integral way. And so that was sort of the angle that I thought we could get into a little bit today. But that's what I'm referring to when I think of this sort of meta narrative that's sort of emerged, that I'm really intrigued in trying to really really explore and get into some of the rich depth of. So one, I guess I would just throw that out there and maybe get some general thoughts, like, is if you'd have anything to add or to that or what have you. And then beyond that, I'd love to just sort of like go through it all, and have some questions for you about some of this stuff. But yeah, I don't know. So in phrasing it that way, do I do a good or a bad job, do you think?
Yeah, well, that is the context within which any attempt at any meta narrative, is going to be framed. It's this cosmological story, and whether or not we are tied to, the specific dating coming out of the inflationary model of physical cosmology, or whether we just say there's a time developmental evolutionary process that has certain general characteristics. It moves from, well, maybe these are controversial points, but there seems to be a tilt toward complexity over the course of time. And that complexity manifests both in terms of physical organization, but also interiority and experience or consciousness intensifies as physical organization complexifies. And so, there's an inner and an outer aspect to this big history. I think, though, that there, what I would want to add is the importance of not too closely wedding this new meta narrative to a particular paradigm within physical science, because I get the sense, and I'm an amateur when it comes to physics, but in chatting with physicists and cosmologists, particularly those influenced by process thought, Whitehead, but also Charles Saunders Peirce and other figures who challenge materialism, there's a sense in which the inflationary cosmology, with it's not even one model, it's really a whole assemblage of various models which make patched together inferred processes based on really scant evidence, because we only have so many measurements of the large scale cosmos. New data is coming in all the time. The Webb Space Telescope is going to go online in a few months. I'm sure we're going to learn a
Mm-hmm.
lot of interesting things there. But the details of the so-called Big Bang model may change. But I don't think, even if a new paradigm emerges that out-contextualizes the Big Bang model, I don't think it's going to replace this sense of a time developmental sequence. That to me seems pretty well established. And while a new paradigm may add more context, I don't think it's going to refute that idea. And so I feel like we're on pretty solid ground working that into our meta narrative at this
Mm-hmm.
point.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's sort of like there's the physics uh angle of this. In some ways, if you're using kind of an integral kind of framework for this, right, there's the right hand model that's going to be open to a lot more just refinement through time, through empirical study. And as you say, we get new data, new information that'll refine sort of the specifics of that evolutionary map a bit more, maybe a lot more, presumably a lot more.
Yeah.
And yet we also need philosophers for sort of that left-hand side of things to think more about, well, what's the relationship of the interior and that exterior? What's the relationship of consciousness, to the form and that sort of thing? And that was one of the things that I wanted to touch on first with you is to try to think through a little bit some of this stuff. I know you've been having some of these conversations and in sort of a general sense with other people who are engaged in the hard problem of consciousness and the relationship of physicalism to all sorts of different models for thinking about consciousness. And so I wanted to get your take on it, right? So like going um, all the way back to the Big Bang, or at least that Planck time unit right after it or something, as far back as we can go. If there is an interior element to everything, um, what is that like? And describe, if you're willing to, like what is that the unfolding and the move of that interior dimension through time and through complexity and through intensity. Tell that story a little bit, because I just want to get your take on that.
Yeah. Well, I definitely feel that the so-called hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers framed it, really we could say Descartes framed it in a different sense several hundred years ago. It's intractable enough. It's really an impossible problem that requires rethinking the categories of mind and matter that the modern world sort of constructed and has forced us to think within. If we want to understand the place of consciousness in the universe, we need, I think, better categories. I turn to Whitehead's thought in search of these categories. He articulates this concept of prehension, which of course Ken Wilber builds on. Wilber tends to put it at the very origin of the left-hand quadrants, which, as Wilber is synthesizing all these various schools of thought and thinkers, which he does a really unparalleled job at, he sometimes, I think, oversimplifies what the theorists he's drawn on are actually saying. And with prehension, Whitehead did not. He certainly wouldn't have been satisfied with it just being an interior sort of process or feeling. For Whitehead, prehension is really an attempt to account for causal relationship as such. Prehension, or feeling, if we want to use a more colloquial term, is the sort of apprehension of data from an environment and the incorporation or assimilation of it into a subjective perspective. But the data itself is objective. So prehension feels objective data, assimilates it into a new subjective perspective. And so if we wanted to think in terms of the quadrants, prehension is sort of straddling the left and right hand quadrants. It's an attempt to integrate these two domains. And so when we look back at the history of the universe, in order to rationally describe physical or mental process, we need some account of causation, right? And so Whitehead's account of causation is that it is, from the very get-go, a matter of one event or occasion of experience, is his term for it, feeling another event or occasion of experience. And for Whitehead, thinking in terms of events or occasions or happenings follows from quantum theory as well as relativity theory in a different sense, in that physics, in its attempts to push the reductionistic method as far as it will go, discovered that, there's no such thing as nature at an instant. Energy comes in these packets, these quanta, and as Planck articulated it, there's a certain duration required even for a single photon to manifest as a photon, right? And so Whitehead builds a whole event ontology out of this, where to be an event is to experience arising out of a past, inheriting what has been actualized in that past, and then anticipating a future and deciding upon, out of many possibilities, what to actualize. When we're talking about photons and electrons and hydrogen atoms, the ability for those sorts of events to dip into the possibilities of the future is rather limited. And so mostly it's reiteration of the past, right? Our normal understanding of causation. In Whitehead's terms, these simpler, say, atomic forms of energy are dominated by their physical pole. That is the inheritance of the past, repeating the pattern that occurred just prior. As you move up the scale of complexity, the ability of organized entities or occasions, actual occasions in Whitehead's terms, to dip into the future increases, right? And so as you get to the biological scale with complex nervous systems, the history of inherited habits is such that it provides more of a platform to reach into the future to realize possibilities via anticipation that simpler forms of organization just weren't capable of. So at no level of the scale of complexity is there pure determinism. There's always a little bit of a mental pull in Whitehead's terms, but that mental pull becomes more and more relevant, right, as you get to the level of living organisms, animals, mammal, etc.
Mm-hmm.
When you get to the human being, our imaginative freedom is so vast that we can begin to reflect upon the universe in its entirety, our place within it. We can contemplate an indefinite span of future time, and we're, troubled as human beings by the fact that the sun's going to explode and swallow the earth one day, and the universe itself might end in heat death or not. But we speculate about all these things because of how intense the mental pull has become But all of that rests upon this long history of evolutionary achievement that has organized our physiology, organized our society and culture, such so as to support this type of speculative
Mhm.
imagination.
Okay, that's great. That's rich. So let's zoom in on some of that. First, a housekeeping question.
Mhm.
So I was digging into process and reality the other day, and like there are bits there that's like, oh, this is so cool and makes total sense. And then like the bulk of it is like, this is so dense and I have no idea what he's getting at. Is it process and reality in which the main current of his thought is expressed, or is this kind of a synthetic thing that you're drawing from multiple texts and versions of Whitehead's work that you could also point to?
So, Process and Reality is definitely the magnum opus. That was his Gifford lectures at University of Edinburgh, and he tried to pack it all in there, but it's dense. And if you want to understand Whitehead's thought, it's super helpful to read his earlier work to get a sense for his trajectory coming out of initially mathematics, mathematical logic, then into mathematical physics in the 19 teens as quantum and relativity theories were starting to come onto the scene. And then in the mid 20s, after he retires from his teaching position in London, he had already retired from his earlier position at Cambridge. He's invited by Harvard to come teach philosophy in America. And it's once he gets to Harvard that he gives the lectures that became Science and the Modern World, 1925. I usually recommend that people start with that book. He's beginning to work out his mature
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical scheme there. And it's really helpful to see he's not only a process philosopher in the sense that he's articulating the nature of reality in processual terms, but his method is itself in process.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see reading his output in historical sequence how his ideas are taking shape. And then after Process and Reality, a couple other important books were published in 1933. So Process and Reality is 1929. 1933, Adventures of Ideas is published, which he continues to elaborate his metaphysical scheme, but he also uses his metaphysics to interpret Western European history, going back to the Greeks, in terms of the way that human beings have gradually been trying to realize certain key ideas like freedom and beauty and so on. And he provides a bit more of a, I wouldn't say it's exactly plain English, but he's not speaking in the technical language he develops in Process and Reality so much. He's trying to use more poetic language in Adventures of Ideas. And then Modes of Thought is his final book, 1938, that's published, where he's even taking a further step away from the more technical language of Process and Reality to talk about the nature of inquiry, the role of philosophy in civilization, and so he, after Process and Reality, he's not fixated on like continuing to just
Mm-hmm.
ram home those particular sets of categories. He's trying to free up his thinking after that.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll accumulate all those and then dip into those and try to pull it all together. But because I see so much, yeah, like incredible potential utility in the way that you're able to apply his process philosophy and his kind of, I guess you'd call it metaphysics, but it's he in some ways is kind of eschewing a kind of purely metaphysical way of thinking in some ways. But well, anyway, without getting too bogged down in that, so articulate this for me then in the more clear and poetic terms as much as possible of say so like Greg Enriquez, draws these complexity domains at matter, life, mind, culture. Wilbur has physiosphere, biosphere, noosphere, basically, matter, life, you could say, culture, the mind, but using it in a different way than Enriquez does. But using those sorts of, tiers, can you speak to what the interior would be at say like, I mean, obviously we have firsthand direct experience of what it's like to be a human being in the sort of noosphere realm of things, but what is interiority for a single celled organism, right? What is interiority for a crystal? things like that. Is it possible to put those into terms that we can understand, or draw meaningful
Yeah,
distinctions between the quote unquote subjectivity that exists or the interiority that exists for those sorts of states of matter?
I can try. William Blake said energy is eternal delight. And so when I try to imagine what it might be like to be a photon or an electron, in some sense, experience at that scale is, even though it doesn't have a very strong mental pull, it's still tapping into what we would call the eternal, in the sense that, photons moving at the speed of light are not experiencing time in the way that other matter does. And so I think mystical metaphors become relevant at that scale. Light has always been treated by spiritual traditions as, in some sense, analogous to the divine. And so I think Blake's understanding of eternal delight, or Whitehead uses the term enjoyment, energy is itself a kind of enjoyment, in the way that when we feel music or when we listen to music, we don't really understand why it's enjoyable, but it seems just the rhythm itself it's a self-justifying aesthetic delight. And so I think aesthetic metaphors that speak to enjoyment and bliss and good feelings are what constitute the dynamics of energy at the simplest level. And for Whitehead, ontology is really for him a subset of aesthetics. It's all about feeling and experience. And the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, it felt better to be something. And that feeling of enjoyment is kind of, it's self-justifying, right? When we get to the level of single cells, thinking in terms of the basic phenomenology of yum and yuck might be the best that we could do. There's a sense of not only the feeling of yum and yuck, but the capacity to act so as to maximize one and minimize the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to get a valence of value, and you get this sense of wanting more yum and avoiding yuck as much as possible. But for Whitehead, the evolution of living organisms needs more of an explanation than that provided just by Darwin's theory of natural selection, which is focused only on survival. If survival was the only value that life was seeking, from Whitehead's point of view, it never would have complexified, because with each complexification, more sensitive sensory organs, more specialization that leads to shorter lifespans for some organisms. With each step into complexification, the survival value of an organism actually goes down. So there must be some other factor here. And so for Whitehead, it's not just survival or the desire to live, to remain alive. It's the desire to live better, right? To thrive, if you will. And so there's some longing expressed even in the simplest cell to experience more, to deepen experience, intensify experience. And then, so when we move up the scale of complexity, the capacity for recognizing and enhancing beauty starts to come online. And I think we already see that in a lot of the higher animals, birds and mammals. Birds will have these elaborate mating rituals. Some species build stages to dance on. The males will build a stage to dance on to attract a female. And so you start to get a sense of, Darwin would call it sexual selection, but for Whitehead, it's the erotic lures that are guiding evolution at that stage to increase the beauty that can manifest in the world. So I think, yeah, these sorts of aesthetic metaphors, from just the sense of eternal delight when we're talking about photons and electrons, to the yum yuck differentiation in single cells, gradually being enhanced to the artistic appreciation that human beings cultivate.
So what let me see if I can put this into words. So that's very helpful, and I like that, and I agree with that, all that. My question, I guess, is for me, there's a metaphor of sort of, the slumbering God becoming awake or something. Or there's a lot of metaphors in alchemy that Jung, also talks about in terms of like the divine sort of being, lost in matter and sort of being needed drawn out. And there's a bunch of different mythological images that could be used too, but um, is there a sense in which this progression through complexification is akin to a waking up? I guess that'd be question one.
Mm-hmm.
Question two is, is it even possible to speak of whatever basis of comparison is there between the kind of interior consciousness that we experience as complex, uh, human beings, and
Mm-hmm.
and a particle, right? Like, what is the common denominator that we can speak
Mm-hmm.
to? And obviously, I mean, well, I say obviously, I presume we need phenomenological metaphors and images to draw from there, but like, to try to get a sense of that gradient that exists, is really what I'm trying to wrap my head around. I don't know. So
Yeah, good question. Well, the first question that, can this evolutionary process be understood in mystical theological terms as the gradual waking up of the divine? And yes, Whitehead has a process theology where initially God in the primordial state, the primordial nature of God in Whitehead's terms, um, God's unconscious, and God's role is as the primordial pole of the universe to provide some evaluation of the infinite realm of possibilities, which then reverberates into how each subsequent actual occasion will relate to that realm of infinite possibility from its perspective in its unique context, right? And so you could see the primordial nature of God as sort of a filter uh, of mind at large, right, in Huxley's terms, that prevents finite occasions of experience from being overwhelmed. But this primordial pole of God is unconscious, because for Whitehead, consciousness always requires relationship, either relationship between possibility and actuality, or a relationship between occasions in a society, actual occasions in a society. And God is alone in God's primordial nature. And so it's only after finite actual occasions have arisen in the course of cosmic history, inheriting God's initial evaluation of possibility, which then gives rise to what Whitehead calls the consequent nature of God, which is God's reception of the decisions made by all the finite creatures in the universe. God feels and suffers with every occasion of experience in the universe, and thereby becomes conscious. Right? God doesn't know God's self except through relationship with the world. Right? And so you can see the process of evolution as God's gradual awakening. For Whitehead, he says in the context of human beings that the power of God is the worship that God inspires, which is to say, Whitehead's God can't reach into the universe like some omnipotent dictator and change what's happening. God works as a lure to try to coax finite creatures to realize what's most beautiful, but the decision's up to the creatures, because the creatures are to some degree self-creating, right? So they're not just creatures. God, Whitehead says, is both creator and creature too, because God is a creature of creativity, which is actually Whitehead's ultimate. God is a creature of creativity, but the primordial creature, which sort of acts as a filter again, right, on pure possibility. And so, yeah, as organisms complexify and intensify their own experience. New sensory organs are developed to enhance perception. As a result of that, God is becoming more conscious. So then, to turn to your second question about the common denominator here, the difficulty of this question is that most of the phenomenological tradition coming out of, you could say, Kant and Hegel, and then Husserl, who really formalizes what we generally call phenomenology in the 20th century, it tends to focus on our sensory experience. I mean, there's Husserl's reflecting deeply on temporality as well, which is important. But when you generally think of what phenomenology is doing, it's like, oh, we're trying to describe our sensory experience. And since Aristotle, who in Book Alpha of his Metaphysics emphasizes vision as the most important sense for metaphysics, the whole Western tradition has been obsessed with our visual experience. That's been the paradigm of clear and distinct knowledge of reality, right? The ears would come in second place because without ears, we wouldn't be able to talk to each other. We wouldn't have this sort of language that allows us to give articulation to the nature of reality. But phenomenology tends to focus on experience through these highly developed sense organs. And for Whitehead, what it's neglecting, not just phenomenology, but the Western philosophical tradition, it's neglecting the feelings of the viscera, which is our feelings of bodily inheritance of the just prior moment of our own experience. It's not a visual experience. It's not an auditory experience. It's closer to touch, you could say, but it's so fundamental to how we become from moment to moment that it's very easy to miss it. But Whitehead gets at this in terms of, he calls it the feelings of the viscera. It's the feeling of inheritance that is best, the closest we can get to capturing it is like, it's not what we see through our eyes. It's like when we walk into a dark room and flip on the light switch and our eyes blink. That's the feeling of what Whitehead calls causal efficacy. We're actually feeling the nerves that typically are transparent because we want to feel what the nerves are transmitting. But when we, or when we have a stomach ache, we're feeling our internal organs, or if another organ is hurting. Like usually we call for a doctor immediately because that's not the case. Typically, all of that is transparent, and we just experience it as emotion, mood, and these other subtle forms of experience that someone like Heidegger is very good at articulating. And so Whitehead's like Heidegger in that sense, that he wants to direct our attention to these subtler textures of experience. He's unlike Heidegger in that he wants to generalize from our own experience of bodily feeling to the rest of nature, non-human nature, and say something, admittedly speculative, about what simpler forms of this experience may have been that evolved into the type of high-grade experience, sensory perception, intellectual reflection, and so on, that was only in germ originally, but comes to full flower in us. And so it's kind of this process of like almost alchemical distillation to peel back all these layers of our own very high-grade experience and to see what's left. And one of the most important critiques that Whitehead makes of Western philosophy is, particularly modern Western philosophy, is the critique of what he calls sensationalism, which is from Descartes through Hume and Kant, all of them see our sense experience through our sense organs as the raw data that we construct a picture of reality out of. And he's saying, no, our sense organs are pretty derivative in terms of what's basic to experience. We need to go back to our pre-sensory bodily feelings to get a sense for what's actually basic to our experience.
Yeah. And it's so hard because you can't do anything outside of the body. I mean, even going into a sensory deprivation chamber, for example, you might be able to kind of calm that noise enough, but you're still experiencing what might be perceived as that pure conscious state through a highly complex brain formulation too, in a way that like a cell doesn't have, or a moat doesn't have. So it's sort of a daunting task to begin to try to find the parallels there. I want
Yeah.
to I want to zoom in a little bit more on this primordial consequent God thing, because that for me is so interesting, and also maybe at this point to bring in the idea of like the one, the many, and the creative force, which I know is sort of really central to his way of thinking about things. Because if you take this idea as I understand it, which is not very well, admittedly, which is why I'm hoping to be, to learn a thing or two here. So, like, let's say you have this primordial God that is unconscious and sort of, in some ways, setting the conditions for what unfolds, but is sort of outside of the picture. Consequent God is, as you say, this sort of, or at least as I interpret, this sort of sum totality of what creatures then are experiencing through this process of unfolding. And then for me, a couple questions arise. One is there an ultimate consequent God, right? Is this process unfolding towards a certain kind of omega point where the God fully wakes up and is sort of then fully self-conscious and fully self-aware, and what's that, and what does that look like? Two is, um, what is the relationship of the creative of creativity to either the primordial or the consequent God? Is that somehow like the projected something of that God working through reality towards something? Is it a third force? Is it, what is it? Yeah, anyway, so some open questions there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, Whitehead doesn't have an omega. It's kind of an open question. Um, for him, creativity is, he also refers to it as the principle of unrest. It's an eternal process, and it's going somewhere only in relationship to God, because God has given some value to the realm of infinite possibility, tilting it towards beauty. And evolution is the result of the lure fed to each creature, to move towards beauty. But there's no end in Whitehead's view of this. There's no omega like you find in Pierre Teilhard de Chardin or something. It's not incompatible with a view like that, but Whitehead doesn't uh, put a bow on the end of cosmic evolution and say this is where it's all headed. He's really more, he emphasizes the way in which each present moment, regardless of its sort of evolutionary location, if you will, in a very simple occasion of experience or in a more complex occasion of experience, like a monk meditating or something, the present moment, he says, is eternal. And this is very much congruent with many of the world's mystical traditions, that the present moment is eternal. Eternity is the full amplitude of time, past and future, being realized in the present. Whitehead's a process thinker, obviously, and so there's a whole succession of present moments which inherit and build upon one another in an interesting way. But if you wanted to find the goal of all of it, Whitehead would say, don't look to the future. It's in the present, right? The entire metaphysical meaning of creation, of creativity, is in the present. You're not going to find it anywhere else because you'll never be anywhere else.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of creativity and its relationship to the divine, I think in some ways, Whitehead's, you were asking to the extent to which his approach to metaphysics is different, right? He's not doing it in the old way, in a sort of a priori sense, where experience needs to conform to the a priori categories or whatever. For Whitehead, he's building on William James. He's a radical empiricist, and so concrete experience is the final arbiter. And if our ideas, our categories don't fit with experience, then we need to revise the categories. And he says that it's always concrete experience which explains abstraction, never the reverse. You can't explain experience with abstractions, because experience is always the context within which abstractions and ideas and concepts arise. And so creativity is, and creativity's relationship to God with the primordial and consequent poles, you could say these are three ultimates, even if creativity is the super ultimate. But what he's trying to do there is, in a radically empirical way, look at the history of religious experience, not just in the West, not just in Christianity and Judaism, not just in Islam, but in Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism, and say, what metaphysical scheme can I articulate that makes room for all of these different perspectives on the divine and on the ultimate nature of reality? And so for the Buddhists, the nature of reality as creativity or a kind of emptiness, they get what they need with his principle of creativity. The theistic traditions get what they need when he adds God. However, most Christians and Jews and Muslims are not happy with the idea of a God that's not all powerful,
Mm-hmm.
and who is the sort of sovereign creator out of nothing of a material universe and human souls. So does Whitehead accomplish his goal of trying to make room for all the world's traditions? Well, some adherents to these traditions think yes, because they're more interested in intra-religious and inter-religious dialogue, and they want to find some common ground. But others are more partisan and aren't willing to make these concessions
Mm-hmm.
on behalf of an integral view that would hold all the traditions together. But creativity as the ultimate is I think Whitehead's attempt to create the biggest tent possible
Mm-hmm.
within which all the history of human religious experience can find a place.
Yeah, you did a much better job than I did trying to explain what I meant about, is it metaphysics at all? Because as you say, he draws that distinction that you don't understand. I forget the exact way you put it, abstractions by means of concretions, but sort of the other way around. Or maybe it's the
Yeah,
other way
you
around. Yeah.
can't explain concreteness with abstractions.
And there's
It
sort of this
always,
the kind of, I think of in some ways, the sort of metaphysical move quintessentially is sort of to think in terms of abstractions as being the ultimate reality, in a Platonic way, right? There's the forms, and then there are participations of concrete, versions of those abstract forms, and but those are somehow less real. But Whitehead is sort of, like many philosophers, certainly post Nietzsche, sort of flipping that on its head and being like, no, it's actually, we abstract based on the concrete. Well, I guess you could even say in some ways that that's what Aristotle was doing. But anyway, so my question though is so if we're not dealing with abstractions, at least not as like fundamental metaphysical entities of ontological reality, but we're dealing with what he calls, right, actualities or actual events, right? Like, you called him a radical empiricist. Like, that's what we're working with here. So when he's talking about God, primordial or consequent, where do we locate this idea, right? Is this an abstraction, or is this something that we actually do have any direct, immediate phenomenological experience of, in his view?
right. Good question. So just to go back to the question of how he is engaging with metaphysics, he's a radical empiricist, right? And so, right, he wants concreteness to explain abstraction and never abstraction explaining concreteness or concrete experience, which is to say that as an example would be attempts to explain consciousness in terms of brain states measured in an fMRI machine. Those are abstractions. You can't explain away the very capacity for observation that allowed for that study to take place, right, in terms of these abstract measurements, just as an example. But to do metaphysics, though, Whitehead is elaborating a categorical scheme, he calls it. And you notice trying to read Process and Reality that the whole first part is him laying out definitions of
Mhm.
these 20 some odd different categories. And it seems super abstract. So it's like you might hear me saying he's a radical empiricist and start Process and Reality and be like, what are you talking about? But Whitehead's not trying to prohibit the elaboration of a categorical table. He does that, but he does it in this sort of recursive way, whereby he describes the method of speculative philosophy or metaphysics as being akin to the flight of an airplane. You begin on the solid ground of concrete observation and experience, right? The history of religious experience, right? The findings of contemporary science, the common sense presuppositions of civilized life, literature and poetry. All of this is the data that we begin with. And then he says the airplane takes off into the thin air of imaginative generalization, right? And so you're abstracting general principles that seem to hold true of all of this data that you're beginning with, right? You elaborate while you're in the air imaginative categories which in some way elucidate the principles at work in the concrete data. Then you land the plane again and test the categories you've elaborated
Mm.
with renewed experience in all of the domains I just mentioned. And so, in this way, there's a open-ended process of refinement of these categories. Right? They're not a priori set apart from experience as the conditions, the necessary and universal conditions out of which experience is constructed or produced in a sort of Kantian way. Rather, uh, they are sort of hypothetical, empirical suggestions that can be continually refined. It's a experimental approach to metaphysics, if you want. It's pragmatic, right? Coming out of the Jamesian tradition again. However, um, Whitehead's not totally dispensing with the idea of necessity, which is key in the metaphysical tradition. Going back to Plato in the Timaeus, it's the creation of the universe depends on these two initial ingredients, necessity and order, you could say. Though necessity in Greek, ananke, is, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, it's more like chaos, actually. So there's ambiguity here. But the point is order and chaos initially, right? Order is necessity, chaos is contingency. Whitehead's not saying everything is just contingent and a function of whatever occurs in experience, right? There are necessities, and for him, the primordial nature of God is a kind of metaphysical necessity. And he makes an analogy to Aristotle, who, as you could say, the first metaphysician, develops a concept of God as an unmoved mover in order to solve a cosmological problem, which is what is the source of motion. Whitehead says physics has advanced. We don't have an analogous problem anymore. We don't have that problem anymore,
Mhm.
the problem of where motion comes from. But we have an analogous problem, which is how does something actual come out of pure possibility? And as I was describing earlier, that's the function of God's primordial nature. There is something actual, we're experiencing it. Quantum theory and other speculations point us to this notion of a plenum of possibility, of infinite energy underlying everything, out of which the universe emerged. And so, how did that emergence take place? Whitehead's answer is, well, we need a God principle of some kind here to solve the problem. And he admits, though, that postulating the existence of this God to solve the problem of the transition from possibility to actuality, he says it is the ultimate irrationality because it is the ground of all rationality, right? And so you could say it's like one free miracle. As far as I can tell, physical science doesn't get away with explaining the universe without its own version of one free miracle.
Mhm.
We have to say, some cosmologists would say, well, there must have been a very low entropy state at the beginning of the universe. In other words, a very highly ordered state at the beginning of the universe in order to account for the organization and complexity we see today, despite the second law of thermodynamics saying everything should be dispersing into disorder. So if you wind the clock back, there must have been a very ordered state at the beginning. Well, how could there be a very ordered state at the beginning if the physicalist story is that order just arises sort of accidentally over the course of long stretches of time because of probability? Like, it's a free miracle, right?
Mm.
So Whitehead is asking us to accept this irrational idea of a God upon the basis of which we can then offer rational explanations for why we have this sort of universe that we experience.
Yeah. Well, and without going into that issue of order and entropy and stuff, because there's a lot there. And actually you could actually make just the reverse, which like Eric Chasson does in Cosmic Evolution, right? That actually, like, basically the heat death already happened, and yet we're getting all this complexity because of this negentropic, thing. And anyway, but we can talk about that some other time. But to home in on this question though about the direct experience of God is something that I'm curious about, Whitehead, because if everything does have this interior component, it seems like, then wouldn't that also in some ways include God as well? What is the interior of God, or something like that, right? And isn't that in some ways you could maybe make the argument what God is waking up to or something?
Yeah, no, thanks for closing the loop there. I wanted to get to that part of your question too. So there's the metaphysical necessity of some kind of primordial nature, right, that accounts for the transition from possibility to actuality. But Whitehead says what further can be known about the divine nature is an empirical question, and not scientific empiricism, but a broader radical empiricism. In other words, through experience, mystical experience of various sorts is our window into the divine nature. And so when we talk about proofs of the existence of God, there's cosmological proofs, logical proofs, etc. Whitehead doesn't think we can prove the nature of God because either we experience it or we don't. And if we don't, Whitehead and process theological thinkers might say that there are certain missing practices that would be required to cultivate experience so as to allow one to peer through that window into the divine nature. But it's not something that you can logically prove because, again, even in the context of what's metaphysically necessary, he admits it's an ultimate irrationality. It's what allows the rest of his categorical scheme to hold together, and you can take it or leave it as a whole. If you don't want to accept that original irrationality, you can have at it, offer your own account of the universe, where it came from and what we're doing here. But for Whitehead, there is this large experiential component, and so the best way to understand the divine nature would be through something like, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Go across all the various cultures, see how human beings have related to this mystery, for lack of a better word, and that allows us to fill out the nature of this divine being. And it doesn't seem to be just a static kind of eternal entity. It's in process. It's growing with the world. It's growing with the evolution of consciousness of human beings, right? And so it's sort of a continuous revelation, and we don't know where it's going next.
But so then, yes, and that then raises the question for me, right? Like, okay, you got primordial God that's sleeping, unconscious. You've got consequent God, which is something like this, summation of finite creatures' experience being expressed eternally, for lack of a better way of putting that. I don't know. But then, and then you got this consequent. Well, that's what that is. But then, what then is that totally numinous, totally transcendent thing that feels complete and total and finished? What's being related to there? Is it? It doesn't seem to be the primordial God. Another way of asking this is I'm trying to get at some of these fundamental ontological categories that are there, right? There's if you imagine this sort of spatially, which might not be helpful, but there's sort of primordial God, consequent God, and then there's like creativity happening in here towards complexity, right? But then you've also got like, well, what is the space in which creativity is unfolding? Like the universe? Well, is the universe part of that? You know, trying to parse some of those, ideas a little bit is still, I'm trying to get sort of the full taxonomy here of these like, fundamental categories to work with. But then on top of that, right, if you are dealing with sort of the God experience and the mystical experience, what is being experienced? Are we jumping ahead to that omega somehow?
Mm.
That's sort of left open, or yeah, does that question make sense? I don't know if I phrased it well.
It's hard to phrase it, but I think I grok what you're trying to articulate, which you know, while Whitehead is in some ways inverting Plato, um, he is really he praises the Plato's work in the Timaeus, this cosmological dialogue, and thinks that all the ingredients, the conceptual ingredients you need, are there, even in light of a couple thousand years of scientific advance. He thinks that Plato's Timaeus actually will outlast Newton's Scholium as a cosmological statement, because Newton was a little bit too um, specialized in articulating a closed conceptual scheme. Plato is vague enough and mythic enough, that it can continue to apply. But some of his intuitions were spot on. And Whitehead thinks while Newton would have been deeply disturbed by the idea of an evolving universe, just as Einstein was in a sense, he wanted it to be an eternal, static universe. Plato would have been delighted by the idea, because the Timaeus is the story of the gradual emergence of order out of chaos. Plato has this concept of the receptacle, and the receptacle is, he says it's like a bastard idea, and that it's not fully eternal, it's not fully temporal. It's the form of formlessness, you could say, because it's the context within which, the matrix within which forms can take on actual existence, right? It's space, but not empty space, right? It's a fertile, verdant, pregnant space of possibility. And so that's where it's all happening. It's in that receptacle that every event which arises in the cosmos, in space and time, finds relationship to every other event in space and time. So it's the context of relationship. And so it's not, the receptacle isn't separate from those relationships, right? It's not empty space within which actual occasions exist or occur and find relationship. It is the relational matrix, right? So that's a Platonic notion that Whitehead continues to elaborate. He ends up calling it the extensive continuum, right? And it's the, it's not a container, and it's a, Plato says it's a dark and difficult idea, because it's not quite an idea. It's the space in which ideas occur.
Interesting. Well,
I'm not
okay.
sure if that helps or makes it
Yeah,
worse.
yeah.
But
Well, it both, which is good, right? Um, uh, so jumping back to what you were saying about, to speak to that divine experience, you have to draw on something akin to like James's Varieties of Religious Experience, or any of the, comparative and sort of, an encyclopedic compendia of these sorts of experiences. One of the characteristics of many of them is in this sort of unia mystica is like the sense that the sort of uh, the erasure of subject-object distinction, including that of creature and creator, and sort of self and God. There's sort of this, oh, we are one and there is only one, and that sort of a thing. That seems to be a kind of leitmotif that's throughout those kinds of accounts. So when you take an idea like that and you mix it in with some of this process Whiteheadian philosophy, and you think of this notion of a slumbering deity slowly waking to self-awareness, I'm left with this image kind of myth of, yeah, just that basically what our very own interior realities are the partial existences, are partial experiences of all that is, which when, as you say, maybe in with the introduction of particular practices, mystical cultivation or what have you, uh, can be opened to the fullness of self-realization, self-consciousness, and the unification with the divine, which is to realize that you are the divine and that there isn't really separation. So to me, that sets this whole evolutionary saga within the mystical framework of, know thyself, know thyself, wake up, you are God, waking up to God's self, you are the conscious, you are the universe becoming conscious of itself, etc. Jung's myth of meaning thrown in here. It's a rich tapestry of this sort of like unfolding, growing to greater and greater self-awareness, which is the mystical experience of the unification of your small s self with the kind of capital S self. Um, Ramble done. Does that resonate with you? Does that work in this schema at all, or is there anything that you would say either what the heck are you talking about, or yes, that more or less seems to accord with this sort of way of thinking? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I don't, even though there's plenty of food in Whitehead's process theology that would feed a mystical perspective, mystical practice. I don't really look to Whitehead for that. I think his cosmology and metaphysics is compatible with this lineage that you're drawing from. The idea that like Meister Eckhart describes of the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. That notion, it's kind of a panentheistic understanding, totally compatible with Whitehead. Um,
Well, what does Matt Segall think?
well, I think that there's both there's a dialectic here, and it's at the same time that I would want to affirm unity with the Godhead. I think it could be that a step along the way to that is realizing the fundamental difference between my creatureliness and the infinite divine ground. Not that that's the end point, but if you skip over the sort of
Mm,
antithesis moment, to put it in Hegelian terms, of unhappy consciousness and being fully alienated from the divine, if you skip over that, then you end up with some kind of touchy-feely, too easy new age woo,
mm.
where it's like, I'm God and you're God, and I can just, whatever I want to be true will come true, and that doesn't work. And so it's like we have to go through the negative moment, and we can't be in blissed out divine unity consciousness all the time. There needs to be a finitude is is essential to creative emergence, to the realization of beauty, right? You could say one definition of beauty. I think this is Schelling's. Beauty is the infinite rendered in finite form, right? The infinite isn't beautiful. It's, you could say it's sublime in the Kantian Burkean sense of like it's too much.
Hmm.
Can't make sense of this. It's formless. But for beauty, which for Whitehead is the pinnacle of experience, for Plato, beauty is like that idea which is closest to the sensory domain. It's like the pathway into the eternal through beauty,
Mm.
from the sensory to the eternal. To realize beauty, you need finitude, So for me, um, I think maybe drawing on my Jewish heritage, there's this like prophetic need to remain historically embedded, facing the problems of our social situation and cultural moment, and not just renouncing that to transcend into the Godhead. Even though being recharged by such transcendent experiences is a crucial aspect of,
Mm.
knowing where we'd like society to go, the values we'd like to guide social transformation, and so on. But I'm not in such a rush to transcend my finite
Sure.
embodied existence.
No, that's makes me think of a lot of things. One is, there's a difference between knowing and doing, in the sense that even in the Mahayana, Bodhisattva tradition, right? You gain that knowing, that sort of gnosis, that enlightenment, glimpse advantage on the world, but then you come back into the world and you act. Um, so you don't leave it, you don't just get out, the participation is the thing. But also even that kind of mystical understanding that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So to participate in the world is not to renounce transcendence. It is still a higher almost form of engagement with transcendence. But it also
Mm-hmm.
made me think of that beautiful poem by Wallace Stevens, Sunday Morning, in which he says that death is the mother of beauty, and the need for finitude to render things beautiful. And I say all that because there's a difference between what I was getting at originally. There's a difference between having maybe some kind of mystical experience and then deducing from that all we should do now is just sit in lotus pose and bliss out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what we take from that potential self-knowledge, if that is the case, doesn't need to be that. It could be all these things that you're talking about,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but it's sort of transformed by that. um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
some reflections on all that. Well, gosh, very fruitful, very, very fascinating. I don't know if we're coming up on an hour and 15, and so we should probably end it before too long. But yeah, I'd love to hear any maybe final reflections on any of this. And there's so much more we could just keep going infinitely, I'm sure. But
Yeah. Well, as John Vervaeke would say, this has been a great dialogos, and I really appreciate your questions. Being able to dialogue about Whitehead or my own thoughts really helps to deepen my own understanding of my own perspective, because I do try to remain in process. And it's not just process philosophy, it's often called process relational philosophy. And that relational element is so key for me to keep the dialectic going, to keep the evolutionary process going. I think the only thing I'd want to add to what we were just discussing is like the importance of not only taking the perspective of the human longing for transcendence, but remembering that, the divine, or say it's like the angels, or the in Tolkien's terms, the elves want to understand what death is and become human. So don't just think of you being this finite being trapped in a body trying to return to God. We're here because God, the angels, the elves, whoever wanted to become human and experience death, right? So embrace the process that you are part of and recognize the value in what at first may seem shitty. You're here for a reason, to experience death and the beauty which is born out of it.
well said. And yes, that also reminded me of that third thing I wanted to mention based on what you were saying is that middle step can't be avoided. You can't just jump to this absolute, oh, I'm God and you're God and everything. It's that, and here I think actually the whole kind of framework that Wilber uses is really helpful. That you need, right? Like you need differentiation to occur before you can integrate something, right? It's not the same of like, oh, blissful being in the womb was so great, or being a child before I was conscious was like paradise. It's like, no, you need to have a self before you can transcend the self. So there's no getting away from that. And it's a necessary, requisite, I would think, moment in that whole storyline. And the other thing I wanted to say too, based on what you beautiful words you just said, was if people watch this and might think, well, what the hell is all this about? And why does it matter? And what meta narrative and whatever? For me, all this is so talk about concrete being important and the real nitty gritty of experience, being important and not this abstract stuff. Because people, oh, there's a great line, I'm going to butcher it, but I don't remember who said it, but it was something like, it was someone defending poetry, and they said there are many people who die every day for the lack of what is found therein, or something like that. The point being that what things that you look at and say, oh, why does this matter? It seems so esoteric. Like there's a craving for meaning. There's a deep human desire to be like, what's this all about? And every day people are uh, committing suicide, are depressed, are living in all sorts of ways that are just operating from a very nihilistic and very kind of unmoored sort of angle. And arguably, a lot of things that we're experiencing as all this dissolution and fragmentation and chaos stem from that. So the idea of having a story that's a meaningful one, that relates you to the whole, that locates your own individual human experience within a broader narrative of significance, like that to me is there's few things, if anything, that's more important than that. And so the work of trying to articulate this meta narrative, for lack of a better term, is for me really urgent, as well as just beautiful and fascinating, and its own kind of expression of the creative advance of beauty and novelty in the world. And it's been deeply meaningful and helpful for me. So anyway, all that being said, I really appreciate your thinking about all this and the deep knowledge that you've got of Whitehead and all these other things. I'd love to talk more with you at some point about a lot of this, but this has been really rich and fruitful. So thank you, Matt Segall. Here's to more conversations in the future. Appreciate you coming on.
I look forward to the next time. Thanks, Brendan.